Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Myanmar. And of course, there have been reactions coming in globally ever since the coup by the military against the democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. She has now been placed under arrest and has been under arrest for a while now, ever since that coup took place. Members of the G7 countries have now called for an end to the quote-unquote intimidation and oppression of those who are opposing this coup, the coup, pardon me. As staged by the Myanmarese military. As I said, we have had for quite a few days now, ever since that coup took place, people coming out on the streets across Myanmar protesting against the military's takeover, the military itself cracking down fairly harshly on these protesters. At first, they seem to have taken, at least from the outside and from my observation, a hands-off approach in the first few days, but then they seem to have been getting harsher and harsher as the days go by. And of course, I'm going to put that to our guests who are joining us now. Just as a final comment too, before we get to our guests, we also had the EU adding on sanctions against the military leaders of Myanmar. Other countries that have placed sanctions against the military leaders and the military junta in Myanmar are the likes of the Americans, the British, as well as the Canadians. And Malaysians, of course, we know have deported 1,200 migrants to Myanmar. That was in defiance of a court order and appeal from human rights groups to halt that process, even though they did not include Rohingya and other ethnic minorities as well. There's a lot to discuss. Let's get to it now. We're now joined by Simon Billenness, who is Executive Director of the International Campaign for the Rohingya. He's also Director of No Business with Genocide. He is joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Joining us today from Berlin is Dr. David Brenner, who is a lecturer at the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex. David and Simon, thank you both for taking your time to join us. David, let me start with you. Let's start with the G7 and its statement calling for an end to the intimidation and repression, essentially, of the protesters. Does it go far enough? I mean, considering the G7 is a fairly strong body, I would think it could do more.
You could certainly think that they might be able to do more. At the same time, of course, we are left, unfortunately, with rather empty statements at this time. When we think who the G7 now is, it doesn't include Russia and it doesn't include China, of course. Both of which are the most strongest backers of Myanmar in the United Nations Security Council. And I don't think that there will be any more forceful interventions of sorts coming now from the G7 or anybody else, because again, we haven't seen any of that sort already before in the wake of what was a genocide. You know?
So, Simon, what's holding the G7 back then, do you think? I mean, we know about Myanmar's allies, so that's an open and shut case, right? But as far as those countries that are not necessarily allied with Myanmar and that would have a problem with, A, the way the Rohingya have been treated in all these years, and secondly, now that the military coup has occurred, why aren't they acting in a stronger fashion? I mean, I know, of course, the sanctions have been placed and there's credit to be given there, but it seems like there maybe more could have been done.
Definitely more can be done. I mean, what we need is sanctions not just on Myanmar military officers and commanders. We also need sanctions on Myanmar military businesses. And the civil disobedience movement inside Burma is already, not just calling on foreign governments to sanction the military. They're going directly to companies to demand that they stop doing their business partnerships with the Myanmar military. And what we're seeing, the reason that we're seeing lack of follow through from the US, from the UK, from the European Union, is because companies like Total of France and Chevron of the United States are doing everything they can to lobby against sanctions on the Myanmar military's business interests. And they're doing that to protect their own business interests. And that is repugnant.
Right. So, I mean, because sanctions have been placed previously, David, on the military junta, I mean, there's this argument that's been made that the sanctions in and of themselves, as they stand right now, will not change their coup and or make them stand down. As Simon there said, we need more targeted sanctions. Do you agree with him?
I agree with targeted sanctions. I also agree with you, Waqar, that the sanctions now will not change the calculus of the military leaders. Indeed, and that is important, sanctions have not brought the military in previous ages as well to rethinking their stranglehold of the country itself. The transition that we've seen in 2011 was not due to imposed foreign sanctions. The sanctions that we see now are targeted sanctions against, for instance, individuals, so asset freezes, for instance, against generals of the junta. Those, after all, are more symbolic. And there is something to be said for some of that symbolism as well. I do, though, think that it's quite difficult in Myanmar to impose more blanket sanctions as we had before, but we should not. Because that is actually something that has strengthened the stranglehold of the military of the country before and driven a lot of people into poverty. I do agree with Simon that one needs to think about very clever ways, indeed, to prevent the kind of revenues to the military in particular. It's very difficult in Myanmar, though, because in Myanmar, as Simon will also know, the military is in control of large holding companies where a lot of the country's economy is going through. The second difficulty, and just to raise that, is, of course, that the military also benefits from the vast illicit economies in the country. So, for instance, to do with the jade mining and other resource economies that go completely beyond those sanctions. So I don't think that the kind of revenues can be changed necessarily, and therefore the calculus of the military generals. But indeed, of course, there's something to be said for foreign investors as well as other people engaging with Myanmar to rethink their particular engagements in strategic industries, as for instance, gas and oil and others.
Right. And then we've also had, the Malaysians deporting these 1,200 migrants approximately back to Myanmar, even though they did not include Rohingya necessarily. But even then, it's still disturbing, right, that a regional country would do that, even though Malaysia has in the past spoken out against what's happened to the Rohingya. I mean, just on that very specific incident, what do you make of it, and how does this play out into how the region is reacting to what's happened?
Well, I want to get back to Dr. Brenner because
Sure.
He's entirely wrong when he said that sanctions don't work. Sanctions have worked very well. The reason why the military stepped back partially from power and allowed democratic elections, which led to Aung San Suu Kyi's party winning a majority in parliament, the military negotiated those changes with the international community and with the US in particular, and they did that to get sanctions lifted. If you talk to any US government official who talked and negotiated with Myanmar military officials, they will tell you that the Myanmar military came to them again and again saying, what do we have to do to get the sanctions dropped? Sanctions worked, and the type of sanctions we're talking about here, as Dave rightly points out, are targeted sanctions that go against the Myanmar military's business interests, that stop the flow of money from oil and gas companies, stop the flow of money from the gem trade, and stop the flow of money from the banks. And this is what the civil disobedience movement is calling for, and we have to back them up. They are already boycotting military businesses inside Myanmar, and we have to make sure that we put overwhelming pressure on foreign companies to also end their business relationships with the Myanmar military. We just did it successfully with Kirin. We got Kirin to end its business partnership. And just today, Facebook has announced, after immense pressure from our campaigns, that they are banning all military Facebook pages. Now, we need Facebook to go further and ban all the military company Facebook pages too. But campaigning is working, sanctions are working, and the only thing that's holding us back from effective sanctions is counter-lobbying from Chevron, counter-lobbying from Total, counter-lobbying from German business interests, and that's what we have to expose and make clear that this is where the military is getting their money.
Okay, so David, you can of course respond to that, and I also wanted to then bring in the Malaysia part as that put. What do you think pushed Malaysia to do this at this time? Is it just a question of the fact that the regional countries and a lot of the countries that have been taking in the likes of the Rohingya and others just continue to feel more and more pressured as the situation in Myanmar now, of course, gets worse?
Let me maybe first respond to Simon there, though, because I think we're not that far apart here when thinking about these strategic industries like gas and oil, etc. Right? I absolutely agree, especially with the civil disobedience movement in Myanmar, to rethink the engagements there as well. It's not very surprising, though, that US officials would tell us that sanctions have worked. I mean, after all, President Obama thought that the transition in Myanmar was of his own making of some sorts, which, though, is entirely wrong. I mean, all actual scholarship would tell us that the military in Myanmar has turned that transition, or has actually initiated that transition from a position of strength rather than anything else. And I think that, while we agree on, I think, actually targeted sanctions on certain businesses, etc., there's just something to be said also for being careful to not sanction the majority of the country in terms of the actual people in the country. And that is something that the CDM movement also makes very clear. On your question about Malaysia, Waqar, it's not entirely clear why Malaysia would be doing this. They're indeed going against the kind of proceedings of their own Malaysian High Court orders here. And there's no present access of UNHCR staff or human rights agencies to the detention facilities. So that is very worrying because, in particular, people are worried that there are many persecuted ethnic minority people amongst those who are being repatriated. Simon will have more insights, I suppose, into that. But here we're speaking about Rohingya people. We're speaking also about other ethnic minorities in the country who've been persecuted for a long time. And so one of the indications for that, for instance, is that also people from the Kachin ethnic minority who sought refuge in Malaysia have recently committed suicide. Very worrying reports about that, which indicate, of course, that what is happening here is completely violating the rights of refugees in Malaysia.
All right, Simon, we just have about a minute left, so I want to give you the final word. What are your thoughts on what Malaysia did?
I mean, I think it's appalling when any country forces back refugees to a country that's just had a military coup, and I think this is the key problem, is that refugees from Burma, and particularly the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, they're not going to want to go back to Burma when their oppressors, when the architects and executors of the genocide against the Rohingya now have total power. So we got to make sure that countries like Bangladesh and countries like Malaysia don't force back refugees to Burma right now.
We'll leave there as a final word, but we sincerely appreciate both Simon and David for taking their time out of their busy schedules to share their insight with us. Simon, they're speaking to us from Washington, D.C., and David was speaking to us today from Berlin. We were discussing there the G7 statement condemning Myanmar's military for its harsh crackdown against protesters who've been out ever since the military coup took place in that country. We've also had the EU added on now to entities around the world, especially within the West, that have sanctioned the Myanmar military junta. Will those sanctions go enough? Everyone's saying, as Simon there pointed out correctly, that we need more targeted sanctions. We need to really hit the business interests of the Myanmarese military junta, considering that is where it gets a lot of its financial support from. Then, of course, we've had Malaysia carrying out this deportation of 1,200 or so Myanmarese migrants, that being condemned pretty much across the board, even though there was actually a court order in place for Malaysia not to actually give those people back to the Myanmar government. We'll keep a close eye, of course, as that situation there continues to develop in Myanmar here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar, Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to continue to discuss, as we have many times before, Iran-U.S. relations, again, within the context of the nuclear deal, Donald Trump walking away from that deal, etc. Now that we have the Biden administration in office, a number of interesting news pieces are coming out. So we've had this news piece coming out that even during the Trump administration and Trump's seemingly, at least what we've understood, efforts to start some sort of a back channel dialogue with Iranian officials, especially during one of the UN General Assemblies during his tenure. That backdoor dialogue did not occur as Trump had wanted. But at the same time, the Iranian Foreign Minister, Javad Zarif, was in fact meeting with Obama-era officials, the likes of John Kerry, Malley, and others. Now, on the Trump side, then, of course, even though he's not now in office, he and a lot of his supporters are saying that what John Kerry did and what others did was essentially go behind the back of Donald Trump and prepare almost for a post-Trump era vis-a-vis relations with Iran. Is that in and of itself unethical? And why exactly didn't relations become better with Donald Trump in office if he had wanted, as at least we're being told, some sort of backdoor dialogue to begin with the Iranians? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Setareh Sadeqi, who is a PhD in American Studies from the University of Tehran. She's joining us today from Isfahan. Joining us this morning from Akron, Ohio, is Dr. Carl Caldenthaler, who is a professor of political science and director of security studies at the University of Akron. Karl and Setareh, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today. Karl, let me start with you. If Donald Trump did want backdoor channel communication with the Iranians, but then the Democrats, i.e. John Kerry and others, were essentially going behind his back in doing so anyhow, is that unethical? Is that wrong?
It depends on what was being said in those dialogues between Kerry and his, Iranian conversation partners. If there was some discussion about, well, we'll just hold off until Donald Trump is out of office and pick up where we left off, that would be probably unethical. If this was just an attempt to kind of keep contact and say, we understand what you're going through with the sanctions, we understand this is a difficult period, that kind of thing, I don't think that's unethical. I've seen the news stories in the U.S. It's kind of a gotcha type of thing. Look, this is collusion. Doesn't really look like it's collusion. It looks more to me like fairly normal conversations that happen between people, governments and people who are out of government. It happened before Trump became president when he talked to the Russians, talked to other foreign governments. So these kind of government to non-government contexts are not abnormal.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, give us, if you can, from what you understand, what is the Iranian logic here? Is it that because Donald Trump had left the Iran nuclear deal, and these conversations, at least for what we've understood, happened both before Donald Trump made the decision to leave the Iran nuclear deal, as well as even after, even as early as 2019. There was meetings between Zarif and Kerry. Is this because the Iranians, in fact, prefer Democrats? I mean, at least on the outside, the Iranians have said it doesn't matter who's in government.
Or the Iranian government says that it doesn't matter who takes office. The hostile rhetoric and hostile policies against Iran have always been in place. But the fact is that the Democrats have shown more willingness to establish dialogues and to come into an agreement with the Iranian partners. Whether or not these dialogues have been fruitful, whether or not they have led to any tangible change in the U.S. policy, that is another question. But Iran has tried every possible channel to engage with the United States and other major powers to prove its good faith with the deal and with its nuclear program, and instead receive some relief for the sanctions that have been crippling the Iranian economy inside.
Carl, if we may then, do you think that this will bear fruit at this time? Because we already have, of course, Biden, who had, at least as candidates, said that he would re-enter the Iran nuclear deal, that is. That has not yet happened. And I would think that he's probably finding it's a lot harder than just snapping his fingers and wishing it back, right?
Absolutely. I think both sides really would like to get to a deal in the end, at least most of both sides. There are definitely pockets of opposition in the United States and in Iran to a deal. Having said that, I think that the main issue is really how you get there. And in this case, the devil is in the details, and those details really matter. Issues of sanctions relief, what sanctions will be relieved, compliance, what does compliance mean? And possibly adding other things in besides the nuclear compliance itself, but maybe missiles or work with proxies, although I don't think that'll really become a central part of this, because the Iranians are very clearly, they won't make that part of this. But there'll be pressure on the American side to include that kind of thing. So this will be a rocky road. This is not going to be an easy thing. It's not a pro forma kind of, we really want to do this, and it's just a matter of getting people together to sign documents. It will take some time.
And Setareh, what is the feeling in Iran about now that we have Biden in office? We know he's made demands that the Iranians should be the ones who first come into compliance once again, at least with their part of the deal. The Iranians have said they are not going to be blinking first, that it's the Americans who are going to have to make the first move. I mean, we're at a stalemate here, if we're completely honest, right?
Right. According to public polls on Iranian feeling about the deal and what their government should do with regards to the deal, it is clear that the Iranian public sees the root of the economic pressures and economic problems more in the mismanagement, the domestic mismanagement, than in sanctions. And they feel that they have given enough concessions to the American and European partners, the signatories of the deal, and it's enough, and it's time for some concrete action to be taken by the other signatories, including, and most importantly, that sanctions will be removed before anything will happen with the deal. And if Iran has abided by the deal and has performed its commitments, and only started reversing its commitments a year after the U.S. withdrew from the deal. So the general atmosphere here is that we have done everything that we could. We have actually done more than our commitments. We agreed to a protocol of inspections that was the most rigorous and the most severe one that no nation has previously submitted to it. So it's time for the other partners to show some form of goodwill and show that they are actually willing to relieve sanctions, and in response or in return for what the Iranian sides have done.
Karl, do you think that Biden will be the president to really re-enter this deal again, or even if he is able to re-enter the deal, to actually lift sanctions on Iran? I mean, would that in some ways, do you think, be political suicide on his part?
It will be very difficult, because one of the things that Donald Trump did to make it very difficult to have kind of normalized relations with Iran and to give Iran economic breathing space, if you want to call it that, was to impose a lot of other sanctions on top of the nuclear sanctions. And so those are going to be a major issue. So you can remove the initial sanctions that were placed there because of the nuclear deal, but then you've got these other sanctions that will have to be dismantled in order for Iran really to feel relief economically from this. And there's going to be tremendous opposition to removing some of those sanctions in the United States, both from Republicans and from Democrats. This is one of the things that really needs to be stressed, is that not everybody in the Democratic Party is lined up behind the idea that friendlier relations with Iran, making Iran's economy freer to fund certain operations or fund certain proxy groups. That's not something that's welcomed by everybody in the Democratic Party. So Biden will have a very tough time. I think this will be one of the central challenges of his presidency, actually.
I wonder, Setareh, as well, in the domestic Iranian politics context, just for a moment, if I may talk about that. We know that the Rouhani government has come under a lot of criticism about what's happened, right, ever since the nuclear deal was signed. I don't want to get into all that criticism, but do you think that this news, and tell me if this news has been sort of met with some criticism in Iran as well, that even with all these talks between, for example, Zarif and certain Democrats, that this hasn't actually borne fruit, that we haven't actually seen something concrete happen in favor of Iran yet?
Yes, actually, that's the main talk that you will hear in Iran, that we have, as I said, we have given enough more than what we had to in order to receive sanctions relief from the sanctions, but nothing has been achieved. And you know that the parliament also passed a law to regarding the deal to limit the extent of Iran's commitments and concessions. But yes, people are criticizing the government for having gone too far to give concessions to the U.S. and other partners without receiving anything, absolutely anything in return.
We'll have to leave there as the final comment. The clock has gotten the best of us. We appreciate both Setareh and Karl for sharing their expertise with us. We were discussing there, of course, these backdoor channel discussions that were taking place between Iranian officials, more specifically the Iranian Foreign Minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, as well as Obama-era officials. And all of this happening, mind you, during the Trump presidency. Did they do something unethical, i.e. on the U.S. side more so than the Iranian side? And has this borne fruit? Will this bear fruit for the Iranians? I mean, all this effort into talking, what exactly has this achieved for Iran as well? I mean, both sides are in a stalemate situation right now, as our guests and I discussed. And will they be able to find their way out of this to a resolution which remains peaceful and remains such that the nuclear deal can remain in place at the same time? I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar, Rizvi. Now, of course, vaccine diplomacy, as it's now termed, is something which is an issue around the world. We've spoken about vaccine nationalism as brought up by the United Nations, but today we want to talk more about the issue of vaccine diplomacy in the context of how, as a case study, for example, the Israelis are using vaccine diplomacy to prefer, instead of helping the occupied peoples, i.e. the Palestinians, providing them vaccines, Israel is handing any surplus vaccines that it may have to countries that have allied themselves with it, i.e. have moved their embassies to Jerusalem as it so prefers. Now, there's of course a lot of debate whether or not within the Oslo Accords Israel is even responsible for providing these vaccines to the Palestinians or not. But nevertheless, as even Israeli experts and officials have admitted, for the Palestinians to still have the virus circulating amongst them remains then a danger, even for very selfish reasons, to the Israeli populace as well. And it makes just logical sense to also provide the vaccines to the Palestinians beyond, of course, the human rights responsibilities, etc., that certainly can be debated as well. And that again goes to show just how vaccine diplomacy can be, if we're completely honest, a very dirty game, where it's a game of political influence, essentially being bought over the human rights, etc. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Khalil Jahshan, who is the Executive Director of the Arab Center of Washington, D.C. He's joining us this morning from Washington. And joining us this morning from Orlando, Florida, is Dr. Yara Asi, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Central Florida. Yara and Khalil, thank you both for your time this morning. Yara, let me start with you, if I may. As a whole, of course, we know that vaccine diplomacy has been spoken about in various contexts, but in the more Middle East context, in Israel, Palestine, what are your thoughts about it, and how, I mean, if I may use the word dirty, a game this really is?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for discussing this issue. You know, vaccine diplomacy is one thing, but when we talk about what Israel is doing, they're actively ignoring their legal responsibilities towards Palestinians. So we would be having a different conversation had they included Palestinians in their initial vaccine allocations, and then they made decisions to send vaccines elsewhere. But instead, what they've chosen is to rely on the Oslo Accords, which unfortunately does not displace their legal duties towards the Palestinians, to say, any vaccines we do give Palestinians is charity, and thus we are able to give similar charity to other countries around the world rather than fulfill our duties to the Palestinians. And it seems especially cynical when you look at the countries who are receiving the vaccines, which, as you said, are countries that have adhered to this Israeli desire to essentially move its capital to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. And so to use vaccines in that regard while ignoring the 5 million Palestinians, including elderly and high-risk Palestinians who are still not vaccinated, does seem incredibly cynical to me.
Yeah, Khalil, what are your thoughts about that? Because as I put in my introduction as well, I mean, just on the basis of just selfish national interest, if we may call it that, it would actually make sense for Israel to help the Palestinians in this case, wouldn't it?
First of all, thanks again. I enjoy your program, and it's good to be back with you. It's good to be back with Yara. Good morning. And let me say this. Frankly, you suggested the term that has been widely used by the media, corona diplomacy or vaccine diplomacy. Indeed, it's vaccine manipulation, and that's ugly, considering the fact that the whole world has seen so many deaths and from this pandemic and continues to be threatened by that. To resort, not just Israel, but countries with financial means and strong countries, larger countries that have had access to it, to be manipulating it, to deprive countries that lack these means, is quite ugly. But specifically here, it's kind of a crazy issue. Back to your question, Israel is, first of all, as Yara said, is not doing the Palestinians a favor. It's actually doing itself a favor. After all, it is the country that is in occupation. It is the occupying power. Number two, there are no borders per se. I mean, the green line is imaginary. And so is, in a way, the wall that Israel has erected to separate itself from the Palestinians. When you consider the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of citizens from both Israel and Palestine crossing these lines on a daily basis, more than 100,000 Palestinians are workers that go to Israel. And if they are not vaccinated, I mean, how is Israel going to achieve, in spite of its record, let's say, vaccination thus far, 80 plus, almost 90% of its population, how is it going to achieve herd immunity when these people are not vaccinated and keep coming in and out? I think it's a very ugly situation. 5.2 million people under Israeli control have only had access to about 33,000 doses thus far, and the situation continues to be threatening with about 178 or more cases in Palestine, plus about 2,000 dead thus far. So, as you referred earlier to Israeli official, the coronavirus czar in Israel himself, Nachman Ash, urged his country to do what he said the correct thing in this case.
Yara, do you feel that at the end of the day that the Israelis will have to relent in this case? Because again, as I said, just logically speaking, it's in their interest to also do this, to also share the vaccines. I mean, even their own officials have said so, as Khalil mentioned, and as you had alluded to as well. So it's not like this is something which is illogical or is being done simply out of the kindness of their heart. This actually just makes logical sense for them. Is this a question of Netanyahu not having the political courage, essentially, to do it?
I think there's several components to this. Israel has for many decades now been arguing that, in fact, these are disputed territories and not occupied territories, and have tried to pull back their responsibilities and say, hey, there's the Palestinian Authority and they have full responsibility here. But unfortunately, the Oslo Accords were an interim process that were supposed to lead to full Palestinian sovereignty. And almost 30 years later, they haven't done that. So to say in this instance that the Palestinians, suddenly they're on their own in this urgent, time-sensitive crisis is a big issue. Israel has relented to some international pressure. As Khalil insinuated, they have allowed some tens of thousands of vaccines to enter the territories, primarily at this point of the Russian vaccine. Israel has said that they may agree to vaccinate those hundreds of thousands of Palestinian workers, but of course those workers go home to their families that are, unvaccinated. And so I think that this kind of slow-moving process of them, kind of agreeing to vaccinate some populations. Last week, there was discussion that in the Knesset that they actually wouldn't allow vaccines from the PA to enter the Gaza Strip out of political considerations, out of, wanting to get something out of the process. So I think that it is becoming A, increasingly politically untenable, and B, as you say, with all these strains emerging from different parts of the world, just an epidemiological reality that these populations are so intertwined. Apart from workers, you have hundreds of thousands of settlers in the West Bank that have easy access to Israel. You have Israeli soldiers throughout the West Bank at checkpoints, raiding homes, etc. And 20% of Israel's population are Palestinian citizens of Israel, often with family in the West Bank, who, travel back and forth to visit. So there is no disconnecting the two populations. And I think that reality, coupled with, statements from human rights groups, some pushback from policymakers in the UK and the US, has shown some movement on this issue. Not enough. Again, there's 5 million Palestinians, and as of yet, there's tens of thousands of doses that have entered, most of which are allocated for healthcare workers, frontline workers. So if you're still a 90-year-old Palestinian at this time, you still don't know if and when you're getting your vaccine, which as the disparity, as Israel is doing so well, getting so much of their population, the health equity is just not there.
Indeed. Khalil, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. As a final thought, I'm wondering, how does this play to Israel's benefit, do you think, if at all? Because, I'm looking at the countries, right? So there are countries like the Czech Republic and Honduras, which are getting some of the vaccines, surplus vaccines that Israel has. And now I believe Mauritania, today I was looking this morning, has also been announced as one of the countries that Israel will give vaccines to. And Mauritania is not actually, right now at least, from what I've understood, an ally of Israel. So Israel's making a huge deal of the fact that, see, we're also giving it to countries that don't necessarily agree with us. Will this be to Israel's benefit? Will this sort of quote-unquote vaccine diplomacy play to its benefit internationally?
I don't think so. I don't think it will play to Israel's benefit. On the contrary, it is essentially harming the reputation of Israel, whether you're looking at it politically or even more importantly, morally. And this is the reason why the Secretary of State, Blinken, called his counterpart and discussed the issue and urged Israel to move quickly to avail the necessary resources to the Palestinians. One meeting has already taken place between health teams, a technical meeting in Ramallah between Israelis and Palestinians, but that's not enough. It has not really started the necessary process to deal with this issue. You get members of Congress who are known for their support for Israel, most prominent of which is definitely Senator Bernie Sanders, who basically, again, insisted on Israel's responsibility legally for doing so, and many voices even in the Jewish community. So it's not beneficial internally or externally to display this form of discrimination and racism to the world, in front of the whole world at this time.
We'll leave it there at that, but we sincerely appreciate both Khalil and Yara for taking their time out and for sharing their thoughts with us on this really important topic, right? I mean, vaccine diplomacy, and again, it's been spoken about in the context of many nations, but now the context of Israel and how it is using its surplus vaccines, and the fact that it has been able to get all these surplus vaccines to begin with, has been able to vaccinate a lot of its population. What of the occupied peoples? What of the peoples whose lands it does occupy? I mean, this is all international law, so these are not my words that are being used as my personal opinion. This is what international law views the dispute as. It is an occupation right now, and within that occupation, Israel has certain responsibilities. And yes, there is a whole debate, I know, on the other side about the Oslo Accords, and certainly that's a discussion that needs to also occur. But even just on logical terms, just even for selfish interests, as I said, it makes sense for the Israelis to, in fact, help the Palestinians be vaccinated so that their population also can be safe from this virus and any possible mutations that may come out. As the WHO continues to say, as long as this virus circulates around the world, more and more mutations and variants will continue to come up until all of us are in some ways or not vaccinated from this pandemic altogether. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.